Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of COWTOWN Movie Classics, and tonight we are doing a wild mix of East meets West, action meets horror, with one of my personal favorite films from not only Shaw Brothers Studio, but England's Hammer Films. From 1974, it is The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, starring Shaw superstar David Chiang teaming up with Hammer icon, Hammer legend Peter Cushing, talking about the film's origins from an Eastern perspective is our returning guest. He is the founder of the Cool Ass Cinema blog, Mr. Brian Bankston. How's it going tonight, Brian?
Going well, Ryan. How about yourself?
I'm doing all right. All right. Well, welcome back.
Well, thank you, sir. Good evening, everybody out there.
As I mentioned earlier, this was a rare collaboration from Hammer Films with Hong Kong's famous Shaw Brothers Studio. And as the Shaw Brothers expert, where was Shaw Brothers at this point in 1974, and why were they interested in collaborating with the Western Film Studio?
Hammer was actually the one that needed the boost, the blood injection, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
They were kind of on the low ebb of the filmmaking spectrum. Had already tried a number of things to get people into the movie theaters, and just the additional blood and nudity it needed more than that with movies like Rosemary's Baby, Night of the Living Dead, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Exorcist, of course, was a massive hit all around the world, and you know, when you got scantily clad women in diaphanous gowns and vampires and their capes blowing in the wind and Frankenstein monster and things like that, that's very antiquated by 1973 standards. So they needed new blood, so to speak, and so the best joint in town would have been to collaborate with Shaw Brothers Studio. They were the biggest film studio in Southeast Asia. Kung fu movies were all the rage. Earlier in that year, in 1973, there was a massive hit called King Boxer, which was released in America as Five Fingers of Death. Mm-hmm. Kung fu movies were being snatched up left and right. They were just huge money makers, frequently in the top 10 in 1973. And Hammer just thought that would be the thing that they needed to get themselves back on their feet. Was going with the big boys of Hong Kong, and it ended up being, in my opinion, it's one of my favorite movies, and I thought it's a vastly underrated horror kung fu film. But you know, a lot of people kind of just diss it and whatnot, I guess. But it was the first time such a film was ever mounted. It was also the first time that a British studio worked with a foreign film company, that being a Hong Kong film company. It just wasn't a match made in heaven, so to speak. There was a number of problems. That I think that the film turned out spectacularly well, considering all the troubles they had behind the scenes. And those problems only exacerbated when they moved into their second and last collaboration with Shatter, or they call him Mr. Shatter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with Stuart Whitman, which is filmed around the same time. So this is a film using above the line British crew, director, writer, producer, and then they're going overseas to Hong Kong in a completely different working environment. I imagine that had some growing pains for the production.
Most definitely. The film began shooting October 22nd of 1973, and it wrapped on December 11th of 73. The film Shatter began filming on December 7th of 73, so there were still a few days left to go on Golden Vampires. The British were already aware of Shaw. They got to Hong Kong. They didn't really like the area. It was a very unhappy situation for them. That kind of got a little spiraled out of control when they felt like they were being controlled and taken control of over the production. But the Shaws were a much bigger organization. You know, they had their own theater network. They were able to film at least up to 12 movies at one time without interruption. Their own distribution network, their own production house. Hammer had none of this. They had to rely on other distribution from outside. They didn't actually have a studio of their own. They were filming in places like Bray and then Elstree. So it was basically, Hammer was basically at the mercy of the Shaws at the time. But at the same time, Hammer Films brought with them a level of professionalism that just wasn't in Hong Kong. They had a lot of guys. They had 45 guys assisting Les Bowie in the film for the special effects sequences, and there's quite a lot of special effects there. And
Mhm.
Les Bowie had nothing but nice things to say about the Shaw organization, but he did say, it was just some of the things were very rudimentary there. So they were definitely behind in the special effects department. And even the actors and actresses said that the Brits were definitely better than we were in terms of the makeup effects and things like that. But when it came to the action sequences, Hong Kong pretty much the Shaw Brothers owned the park there.
Mhm.
So it was sort of you had positive and negative for both sides, but at the same time, the Shaw, or excuse me, Hammer was at a low ebb in their great career. The Shaws were like the shining star at the moment, and so it was just something that the British company had to deal with at the time. And the sad or ironic thing was that Shaw Brothers would eventually, the decline of Hammer, the Shaw's decline would mirror Hammer's decline towards the end of the decade. So both companies just could not change with the times properly. So where Hammer was on top of the world for a while, and then they just fell off the map because they could not change with the changing trends at the time. The same happened with the Shaw Brothers, and they kind of went downhill, couldn't change the time. So it's apparently the Shaws were well aware of the issues that the Brits had because they tried to rectify it. Shortly after the filming wrapped with the Brits, they started work on a 6-story facility that was for foreigners to stay, and it was air conditioned because one of the problems that people didn't like was there were no soundproofing in the studios. They shot with no live sound. There was no air conditioning. You could bring a personal air conditioner with you if you wanted, but there was no air conditioning in the studios.
Mhm.
So to rectify this, to try to enhance the attractiveness of foreign companies coming to Hong Kong to film there, they built a 6-story facility specifically for Anglos to live in during the time. And I don't know how many movies they utilized, foreign companies utilized this facility, but I do know it got great use when AIP went there and other technicians went there to film the movie Meteor
Mhm.
with Sean Connery. Do you remember that one?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the Shaws had a financial investment in that film as well. That was one of the complications apparently during filming was that the plan was, I guess, to shoot without live sound, and the Brits said no, there's no need for this. We're bringing our own equipment, so we will definitely be shooting with live sound. And they were also going to use a temp track like they normally do for the music. They're making so many movies in Hong Kong. It's just not enough time to make a original score for every single movie. So they thought, well, we got James Bernard, we're going to do our own score. So that
Yeah.
was another difference with the Hong Kong cut was I don't believe they used the James Bernard score for their version of the film for the local version. So
Oh wow, which is definitely a shame because it's one of the high points of the film, I think.
yeah, and I have no proof that they did not use the James Bernard score, but I'm just saying that they had their own version
Hmm.
that utilized sequences that weren't in the British cut. So most likely they used. I'm guessing that they probably used their own methods in terms of the music. So
Yeah, well, they say, I don't know what the term is. Is it like, adversity breeds genius that, when you're giving these creative restraints or put in these kind of uncomfortable circumstances, I think you work harder to make something that's good. You're fighting for what you believe in. And David Chang, I remember hearing an interview from him. It wasn't even on, it had nothing to do with Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. They were just talking about his acting career. And he mentioned when he did work on the film, he really appreciated working with Peter Cushing because Peter Cushing took the time to sit with him to go over the lines in English, to study and practice. So he said that relationship with Peter Cushing really helped David grow as an actor.
oh, most definitely. Peter Cushing is my all-time favorite actor over everybody else. Peter
Yeah, he's
Cushing is
up.
my
Yeah.
all-time favorite. Just an amazing man. I've never read a bad word about him. When I interviewed Kevin Connor a
Mhm.
year or two ago, we talked about Peter Cushing, and he just beamed, Peter just popular, or excuse me, positive Peter Cushing notes from the times he worked with him. Just I love that guy. I love his acting, love his films. Even if it's a bad movie, he builds up the badness in the movie, so he makes a bad movie good.
I'm glad you say that actually, because Peter Cushing, he's one of a handful of actors. To me, I would say like Peter Cushing or Edward G. Robinson. It didn't matter what kind of film they were doing, what budget, what genre. It didn't matter. In every film they're in, they're taking it as seriously as if they could get an Oscar. I mean, that's how professional they were as actors. of what they could bring to the material, and they never behaved like they were above the material, right? They took
Exactly.
everything as seriously as they could.
Exactly. And David Chang and Peter Cushing, in my opinion, were a great uh, duo for that particular movie. They really worked, in my opinion, worked very well together.
Hmm.
And it was just, you couldn't have, the only thing that would have made that movie that would have elevated Legend of Seven Golden Vampires would be if they had been able to convince Christopher Lee to come back one last time.
I agree, but the movie's still pretty good.
Oh yeah, it's a fantastic movie. I love it. And Chang Chan did a fantastic job playing Ka, the guy that Dracula possesses his body.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, a fantastic character actor. He doesn't get enough credit that he deserves, I think, but I thought he did a great job in there in the role of Dracula in the Chinese guy's body. So
In the Hong Kong film industry, historically, like you said, this was the first time this type of production had been put together. But of course, later on, like in the 70s and 80s, you would get other kung fu horror kind of pastiches. I think of like the Mr. Vampire series, and these would become much more popular later on. But was there a horror element that was popular in Hong Kong films before Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, this type of supernatural film?
oh yes, they had the Shaws had produced The Enchanting Shadow in the 1960s, but those films weren't really combining kung fu fighting. They were just straight horror pictures. There was
Hmm.
lots and lots of them. They seldom get talked about because horror movies weren't really that big of a box office draw in Hong Kong. I mean, they would make decent money, but they weren't like big money making endeavors. The indie films, there was lots and lots of them made on the indie film circuit. Many of them predominantly, if you're familiar with Japanese horror at all, if you watch
Yeah.
a number of them, you'll say, oh wow, this is like they've just taken this from Yatsuya Kaiden. There was
Hmm.
so many of them that just follow the Japanese template. So the Japanese horror was extremely influential on Hong Kong and Taiwanese made horror films when they did make them.
Hmm.
But the genre itself did pick up steam in the 1970s, as particularly with the director Kwei Chi Hung.
Hmm.
He was I guess the first one that really was the flag bearer for Hong Kong style horror. But the Legend of Seven Golden Vampires was the only kung fu horror picture until till Sammo Hung really popularized it in 1980 with the Encounters of the Spooky Encounters
Yes.
film. Yeah, that would be the movie that really kick-started the kung fu horror genre. So, but Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires was definitely first. The movie made I don't know what it made in Singapore. I've been told that it made more money in Singapore than Hong Kong. It made around 700,000 Hong Kong dollars, which is a modest success.
Hmm.
One reason I think that the movie didn't make $1 million is because most Chinese people, at least the ones I know, they think Dracula is silly.
Right. Well, especially in this film, unfortunately, that if I had to single out one weakness of the movie is, of course, Christopher Lee. At this point, he was sick and tired of playing Dracula. They couldn't get him back for one more film.
I never really had a problem with. I know a lot of people had a problem with his makeup. It was sort of this greenish pallor that they gave him. It was sort of over the top, I guess, like you said, very
Yeah.
kabuki style. But it never really bothered me that much. But I can understand why some people would be bothered with it. But I like John Forbes Robertson as an actor. I
Yeah.
liked him, especially he was in the Vampire Lovers. He was
Right. Yeah.
the vampire in the top hat. But yeah, I could have done without Dracula being in the film. But I think they had made a multiple cuts of the film with and without Dracula. And so they just decided to put him in. And I think the Shaws may have had a hand in saying, no, we'd like to have Dracula in there because their version was titled Dracula and the Seven Golden Vampires.
Hmm.
Whereas the British version was just, Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. So
Yeah. And then, of course, later on in the United States, they would recut the film. And in my opinion, they absolutely butchered it for the American release. They called it was The Seven Brothers Meets Dracula. But it did, like as you mentioned earlier, it has an amazing tagline: Black Belt versus Black Magic.
exactly. Yeah, the problem there, I think the problem there with that version of the film is that in the 70s, Kung Fu movies were, even though they were big money makers, I think people kind of looked down on them because there was very little story in them. That, oh, people just want to watch fights. It's all they care about is fight, 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 fight. So then when Dynamite Entertainment, when the people running the company decided to butcher that movie, they just assumed, well, we can just do without all this story and exposition stuff and talking. So we'll just cut it up to where it's nothing but just action, the action sequences, because that's all people want to go to see anyway. So it's sort of an insulting. It's very similar to I feel like the term chop socky is very derogatory,
Yes.
condescending title, and I think that's the way a lot of these distributors and producers looked at the films themselves, just to, try to make a quick buck off of them. They didn't. Well, a lot of the films themselves, to the Chinese producers too, I think were just interested in making a quick buck, and they didn't really care about story and whatnot. And people were constantly telling them in the Chinese magazines, anyways, journalists and whatnot, were saying, if you guys would just enhance your product and maybe not make so many of them at one time, the quality would go up, and maybe the export market might take them more seriously. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, really. But that's the nature of the '70s, and it's a time that we'll never see again.
So the last time we spoke, we were talking about the movie Crippled Avengers, directed by Chang-Chi, and I've always heard rumors that, okay, so Roy Ward Baker, he directed all the dialogue, and then Chang-Chi was the one who actually choreographed all the action sequences. Does this have a basis in reality? What's the true story behind that?
Well, what I can tell you is that there were plans when the British crew felt like that they were going to be taken over. The Shaws didn't like the way the fight scenes were looking, so they were originally going to take the film over, and the film's choreographer, who was Lu Liang, he was going to at first allegedly he was going to take the film over.
Let me ask you real quick. So sorry. So Lucia Lang, I know there's different translation. Is that Lau Kar Lung? Is that also?
Yes,
is that him?
yes,
Okay.
in Cantonese. Yeah, in Cantonese it's Lau Kar Lung. And the Mandarin, of course, which is the way his name is spelled on the credits and all the films, is Lu Liang.
Yeah.
I always just use the Mandarin's pronunciation because that's what's on the credits. So if I try to say both the Cantonese and the Mandarin together, but I don't like to confuse people too much. So like when you're watching the film, if I said Lau Kar Lung and you look at Legends of Seven Golden Vampires and it says action choreography by Lu Liang, you're going to say, well,
Right.
I thought it was Lau Kar Lung. So people
Yeah.
might not know the difference. But originally, supposedly, Lu Liang was going to take the film over. Then I had read there were rumors that, and this is in the Chinese publications, that they were going to possibly get Chang-Chi to just observe the action. And Roy Ward Baker, this got back to Roy Ward Baker, and he was furious about it. He said, if you're going to bring somebody else in to take over, to co-direct with me, there's no need of me being here. He said, I don't need a co-director. He says, I can do all the action. If they want to have someone just like to be there as an advisor or something, that's fine. He said, but if you're going to have somebody else trying to direct with me, then there's no point in me being on the show. So he was ready to quit the film.
Yeah.
So if Chang-Chi did anything at all on that movie, it was just in an advisory capacity. Like if he might just be there and say, well, we would do this. This is how we would do this part here. But Roy Ward Baker was the only director on the film. Now, when the British crew packed things up and left to go back to the UK, it's entirely possible that they may have gotten Chang-Chi or someone else to direct additional scenes for the film, for the Hong Kong release. Now, that I couldn't tell you because I've never seen the Hong Kong version of the movie. What I can tell you is that according to Chinese reviews of the film from the time, there was definitely different sequences in there. One of them, the main one that they seemed to be really fond of, was the very tame sex scene between Robin Stewart and Shi Zhu, which is not in the British version of the film. There's a number of photographs of it from different angles in Chinese publications. That's the only major sequence I know of that was utilized. There were also scenes involving Julie Eggy and the Chinese actress at the beginning. She was supposed to be the wife of Roy Hanna's character, the consul that's talking to Robert Stewart at the beginning of the film. There were sequences shot with them. There's images and photographs of this sequence, but that may possibly be in the Hong Kong cut, but it does not exist in the British version or any of the international cuts that I have seen.
So the Hong Kong version, it's never been remastered or included on any of the Blu-ray collections or anything like that from Shout Factory, or
no. The only reason I've ever heard was that Celestial. Apparently, they have remastered the international cuts, but they said some of these they would not be putting out in Hong Kong because of licensing issues.
Hmm.
They did restore and remaster The Deadly Angels because it came out in Germany on Blu-ray, but they did not release that movie in Hong Kong. So
I see.
that was the Deadly. That's the Charlie's Angels, the R-rated Charlie's Angels movie the Shaw Brothers made. So
Oh, okay. Oh, that's cool. I'll have to check that one out. So, as a Shaw Brothers purist, right? You're obviously a lover of Hong Kong cinema. What do you think of the actual fight choreography in the film? Do you feel like it stacks up with some of the better Shaw Brothers films? Do you have any criticisms of the actual action in the film?
no, I think the action. This is just strictly my opinion. I think the fight sequences are very well done. I think they're uh, successfully brutal in the typical Chang-Chi style. So, if I were to say Chang-Chi was observing the set, definitely his presence was felt because he was already in the midst of setting up Longbow in Taiwan.
Hmm.
So, Liu Qiliang was choreographing his action. So whether he was there or not, Liu Qiliang was most definitely uh, doing the Chang-Chi style with the heroic deaths and the bloody kills. There's dismemberments in the film and arrows piercing bodies and bloody axe wounds and things like that. I thought the very first fight sequence where they're fighting out on the New Territories area where they shot films like The Water Margin
Hmm.
and Heroic Ones and things like that. I thought Roy Ward Baker did a fantastic job directing the fight sequences.
Yeah.
Um, well, I mean, directing the film, but gelling it all together, making the fights and everything else work within the framework of the film itself. I thought the music was great. I thought that the international version, as we know it, is just a fantastic, very vastly underrated motion picture. I love the all of the major fight. If you watch the film, the fight sequences become more and more perilous for the heroes. It's like they lose a little more as the movie progresses, and then by the time the final fight takes place, you can tell that they're extremely exhausted. And at the ending is when they start being killed off. The good guys do. I
Yeah.
just thought there were some great sequences in there. Just absolutely some of the best stuff Hammer ever did, in my opinion, is in that movie. Despite the fact that a lot of people that are fans of Hammer kind of diss on the movie, I think it's because
Yeah.
it's not a pure Hammer film. It's because it had, it's partially done collaboration with another company. So, but I particularly loved it. I think it's great.
Oh, certainly. And I'm glad you mentioned the music because so the score of the film, it was done by James Bernard, who is Hammer's go-to composer. He did the original scores for The Curse of Frankenstein, Horror of Dracula, uh, a lot of the great Hammer film. Like when we associate the Hammer film sound, it's the music of James Bernard. And I'm going to go out on a limb. I think this might be his best score because he intertwines the horror of Dracula theme with this kind of Oriental motif, and it just works. And it definitely
Oh yes.
emphasizes the action. It's an incredible work.
Yeah, I've got I don't think it's the entire score, but I have one of the Hammer CDs I have. It's got a very lengthy suite of the Golden Vampire score on there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I also wanted to give a shout out. I wanted to let our audience know that, as a kid, I grew up watching Hammer films. They're very near and dear to my heart. So when I got this movie from Anchor Bay on VHS back in the day, so this is my original copy from when I was a kid. This was actually my entryway. This was my gateway drug into Shaw Brothers cinema. So Anchor Bay Hammer Films, I want to thank you for that. All right, Brian, do you have any closing thoughts on Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires before we get started?
No, just that I feel like that you guys there about to watch the film are going to be vastly entertained. At least I hope you will be. You're going to see some good horror action, some great choreography. David Chiang speaking English, Peter Cushing acting, even participating in the action himself. I love the scene where he says, "Strike at their hearts." It's just great stuff. And I think you guys are going to really love it. I hope you got a big bag of popcorn there.
Oh, absolutely. Well, Brian, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Ryan, for having me again.
If you're in the audience, please stick around after the film because we are doing something a little bit different. So, as Brian is our resident Shaw Brothers expert, we will be joined by returning COWTOWN Movie Classics guest Jonathan Rigby, who, of course, is the authority on all things Hammer films, to hear his perspective on tonight's film. Without further ado, from 1974, director Roy Ward Baker's The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. Joining us for the second half of this conversation is returning guest of COWTOWN Movie Classics. He's a prolific film historian, critic, actor, and author, Mr. Jonathan Rigby. How are you doing tonight, Jonathan?
I'm doing very well. Nice to speak again.
Oh, of course, yeah, it's always a pleasure. As a lifelong fan of the Hammer horror films, what was your first exposure to Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires?
My first exposure was hearing about it and thinking that a sort of, combo of gothic horror and kung fu sounded kind of grotesque and sounded a bit desperate. Given where Hammer were in 1973, the word desperate springs to mind.
Right.
But then you eventually see it and you actually realize that, there are things wrong with the film and it was an extraordinarily difficult film to make. But actually the idea was inspirational in a way because, the east-west pollination, if you want to call it that, really starts to work. And even at this very late stage in the game, Hammer were making an enormously influential film because the whole sort of intersect between vampire cinema and action cinema is something that was going to take off in a big way. Particularly in the late 90s you get the Blade films and you get the Underworld films and any number of successors, if you like, to the Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. It's a small film, and I don't suppose anybody involved realized it would be influential, but it has been.
Hmm. And what are your personal thoughts on the film, having rewatched it this time around?
My personal thoughts, I like it a lot. I mean, there is quite a lot wrong with it, and a lot of that is attributable to the kind of culture clash that was involved in making it, because of course a British crew came over to Hong Kong and were stupefied basically by the filmmaking methods that prevailed over there. I mean, the big bone of contention for the director Roy Ward Baker was the fact that the Shaw brothers didn't see the point in recording sound, because of course they didn't. Their custom was not to record sound, and just to dub it on later. And for Roy Ward Baker, that would adversely affect the rhythm of the film and the performances, and also it would be enormously expensive to go back to London and post-sync everything.
Right.
So he was determined on that particular score, but there was a huge amount of culture clash, basically. I mean, the Shaw brothers, by all accounts, didn't see the point of reverse over-the-shoulder shots in conversations. Film grammar of that kind. They just thought that these were fripperies that were time-wasting and expensive. And indeed, as far as the Shaw brothers were concerned, the film did go over schedule. They wouldn't have spent so long on a film, but it was it was an unhappy marriage in many ways. And Roy Ward Baker reeled away from the filming. Having had one of the unhappiest experiences of his filmmaking life. And Michael Carreras, who was the head of Hammer at the time, said it basically killed his interest in making film. But the funny thing is, the end result is great fun, and it does work. You think you put Van Helsing out in the middle of China, it sounds preposterous. But of course, as Van Helsing, curiously enough, in the original novel Dracula points out, as he points out in the novel, of course, vampire legendary and myth is endemic all over the world. So why not send Van Helsing out to China? Of course, China has its own tradition, particularly, where the hopping vampires are concerned. And that's one of the things we see in this film. And that's one of the reasons I love this film, actually, is at the beginning, well, near the beginning anyway, Van Helsing relates the legend. Yes, you see the uprising of the dead. They're summoned by a gong. And of course they're led by these seven golden vampires on horseback, and the rising of these proletarian zombies. They've got their aristocratic overseers, the golden vampires on horseback, and these proletarian zombies with their hoes and their various agricultural implements and their skull faces, and they basically jig on their way to get their victim. They're actually completely completely superfluous because the seven golden vampires could cut that farmer's throat quite easily without them.
It's
But I
true.
suppose they just make a huge impact because they just follow in their wake. And that whole uprising sequence and James Bernard's music. Again, you see, the Shaw brothers were used to just using library cues. For them, the idea of getting somebody in to score the film specially was a needless extravagance. But Michael Carreras was determined on it. James Bernard, I think, only had about a fortnight in which to do it, and he was a slow worker, so it nearly killed him, by his own account. But what a score! I mean, obviously, because it was commissioned so last minute, he had to incorporate into it quite a number of themes and echoes of his other Dracula scores. But it's terrific, and in that Uprising of the Dead sequence, and by the way, there are two of them because it's so good. Hammer very sensibly repeated it at the end, pretty much. The music there is terrific. Oh, and the sound design. It's almost as if those zombies have bells on their toes because there's this unearthly jingling sound that accompanies everything. And you get the wind wailing, and slowly the wind morphs into screams. You know, subdued, low-level screams coming from the deathly pagoda. You know, I think all this imagery is terrific, and those two sequences are, in particular, great.
No, absolutely. Especially, with the James Bernard score.
Yes, well, that's the funny thing. He only had a fortnight to do it, but it is certainly one of his best scores. I think back in about 5-6 years before this, Hammer went to him with The Devil Rides Out, and for some reason, when the score wasn't on it, Hammer were very worried about The Devil Rides Out, and they said, this needs a good meaty score because, this film really needs it. And of course, The Devil Rides Out turned out to be terrific.
Yeah,
but I think really The Legend of the Seven Gold Vampires is that's very definitely a case of that. This film needed a really good score, the kind of score that would get your pulses going, both in terms of the action side of it and also the scary side of it, because Bernard was a past master at that, obviously. And it got that. And to be honest, without Bernard's score, I think it would be a much lesser film.
Absolutely.
But that often applies to film. I mean, a good score is essential.
Absolutely. Well, no, like you said about the Shaw brothers using stock cues, library cues, I've seen so many of these Hong Kong movies, as wonderful as they are. You're watching this medieval Chinese acrobatic fight scene, right? And then you hear the music from James Bond. You hear the John Barry score pop up, or Shaft, or Star Wars, right? It's all over, but that's part of the charm, I think.
That's part of the choice. It's difficult for other cultures perhaps to get their head around that, but that's what they are, and that's what they did. And yes, you're right. It's charming, but it wouldn't have worked for this film because this isn't just a Shaw Brothers film. It's a Hammer film, and it's sort of following in a long line of Gothic Hammer hits. And by the way, it was quite a big hit. It was a big hit in the UK, and I believe it was a huge hit when it. In its original territories when it first opened in Singapore, and I think actually it opened in Singapore before it opened in London. But it made a lot of money. But the trouble was Warner Brothers in the USA had lost interest. Apparently they were very encouraging during the shooting of the film. They were sending Michael Carreras memos saying, "My God, this stuff looks good. We're liking this material." And Michael Carreras himself, he said it's got a lot of action and colour, and he was absolutely right. But when it came, I think the trouble was, when it came to actually releasing it, The Exorcist had come out.
Yeah.
And of course, that was a Warner's film. And they completely lost interest in releasing it in America, and eventually it was put out by a very small distribution outfit in 1978, 5 years after it was shot. And it was retitled The Seven Brothers Meet Dracula. And it was also cut severely. I think it was a good 15 minutes taken out of it. If not more, actually. So, yes, it sank like a stone in the USA, and of course that helped hasten Hammer's demise. So Warner Brothers, had been in at the beginning of Hammer horror by, with The Curse of Frankenstein in 1956, and they were very much in at the demise. They really helped on the demise of Hammer horror. And the funny thing was, The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires opened at the same theatre in London's Leicester Square that The Curse of Frankenstein had. It was called the Warner Theatre in 1957, and by 1974 it was called the Warner West End. And as I say, it was a big hit there, but it is the historical thing, the historical, alarming moment is the fact is that, of course, The Exorcist several months earlier had also played there. And really that called time on Hammer horror. It's a tremendous critical cliche, isn't it? It's a critical commonplace. The Exorcist came along and horror was never the same again. In particular, Hammer horror was rendered inoperative by it. And it's a cliche, but, cliches are cliches very often because they're true. And, it's just, that's how it happened. You look at the Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires in relation to something like The Exorcist, and of course it's an absurdity as a kind of player to actually get the audiences in. But it's great fun. It's a great fun film. And if you've got Peter Cushing in a pith helmet shouting, "Strike at their hearts," then, what's not to like?
Oh, of course. And so Brian Bankston, earlier we kind of discussed how Hammer Films and Shaw Brothers both followed similar trajectories, because even the Shaw Brothers, by 1974, a lot of their great kung fu classics had yet to be made. In the 80s, you still had movies like The 36th Chamber of Shaolin. You had The Five Deadly Venoms in the late 70s. You had superstars like Jackie Chan, Sammo Hung, who were doing these really wonderful contemporary action films. By the time you get to the late 80s, the Shaw Brothers stuff, their period pieces are looking pretty old-fashioned by then.
Things move on, and often the innovators, the people who push things forward, the more successful their pushing forward is, the more they're going to be left in the dust. Within 10 years or so, they're going to start themselves to look old-fashioned because of the degree to which they influenced other people. That's exactly what happened to Hammer, and clearly exactly what happened to the Shaw Brothers too. It's just a fact of cinematic life, if you like. Yeah. But The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, I must say, Don Horton, who wrote the script and also produced it, and by all accounts was not cut out for being a producer, his scripts, he'd written some very, very good scripts for Doctor Who, actually, but then he got very much embroiled with Hammer films, and his scripts have a florid quality, particularly where the dialogue is concerned, particularly where people like Dracula are concerned. Their speech patterns are quite melodramatic, much more so than in previous Hammer films. And with this one, there's not much of a script there, to be honest. Although I have to say, it's a kind of quest narrative, isn't it, in many ways? First of all, you get the old farmer in the legend related by Van Helsing. He's on a quest to save his most prized possession, Van Helsing calls her. In other words, his daughter. He's on a quest to save her. And he fails miserably, actually, doesn't he? Because the minute he bursts in, his daughter gets killed. Yeah. But subsequently, of course, you get another quest narrative, because, of course, you get the wagon train affair of going through the desert. This is one of the things that caused a huge problem for Roy Ward Baker, because, in fact, I've got a quote here from Roy Ward Baker. He said, "This was a classic example of inadequate liaison, reconnaissance, and planning." He felt that the Hammer team should have been out there 2 months in advance. By the team, he meant himself and his assistant director and sure. Don Horton, the producer cum screenwriter. But instead, they only got there 2 weeks in advance. And, of course, they then discovered that there are no deserts around Hong Kong. And they had to, do what they could to kind of simulate the mere notion of a desert. This is just typical of the problems that were involved. The centerpiece of the film really is a big trek through the desert, and there wasn't one. So you can see he was tearing his hair out. But nevertheless, that's quite a romantic thing. The kind of wagon train that goes through the desert, and they're on their way to the forfended place, a very, very scary place, and what will they find when they get there? And, of course you've got Peter Cushing being his usual marvelously professional self, coming up with making quite a lot of not very good dialogue sound really classy, just because that's what he did. I feel a little sorry for Van Helsing in this film, because he starts out at a very low ebb, because of course he's being laughed off the stage effectively by a bunch of Chinese academics, because they all think his ridiculous Western superstitions are preposterous. So he starts at quite a low ebb, and he looks a bit woebegone through quite a lot of the film, actually. But of course you also get to see Peter Cushing doing his own stunts.
Hmm.
He's waving that torch around, and there's one particular one just before when he actually meets Dracula in the flesh at the end, when Dracula reveals himself in his true colours at the end. Dracula slaps him, and you see Cushing actually tumble over one of those sarcophagi that form that sort of octagonal bunch of coffins around the central blood vat, which, by the way, is an incredibly good design by a Shaw Brothers designer called Johnson Sow, who Roy Ward Baker thought the world of. But Cushing does that tumble over that sarcophagus himself, and you think he's a 60-year-old man, and quite a frail 60-year-old man, and does this thing himself. It's really very impressive. But of course, this is one of the disappointments of the film. Dracula has finally shown himself again after having appeared right at the beginning. And he's killed almost instantly. Maybe this was a problem with the Hammer films generally, because Hammer didn't quite know what to do with Dracula. Of course, Christopher Lee doesn't play Dracula in this film, but Christopher Lee was, set the seal on their Dracula films, obviously, with his interpretation. But there was something he was absolutely brilliant as Dracula, for me, the best Dracula, but there was something so monolithic about Christopher Lee's Dracula that it kind of stupefied Hammer's screenwriters. What do you do with a figure who is so monolithic, And they modernised him in the end, shortly before this film. Sent him into modern-day London. But here you've got John Forbes Robertson playing him. I think playing him very well, actually. He does some marvellous eye acting in his first scene. He has this marvellous line where he says, I've been confined to this terrible place. This miserable place is the line. And then he repeats it, this miserable place. And his eye acting there is terrific. But he has so little time to make an impression. And also, for reasons of their own, Hammer dubbed him with a different actor. They dubbed him with David DeKeyser, who was a go-to kind of voiceover guy. And indeed, he'd done a big vampire character in a film called Vampire Circus for Hammer just a couple of years earlier. So it kind of takes the edge off John Forbes Robertson's performance. It's one of those occasions where the actor can't prove how good or otherwise he was in the part because it's not his own voice. It's a shame. It's a shame. I must, however, mention that the makeup in the film, was in the hands of the Shaw Brothers personnel, and I think Roy Ward Baker didn't get a memo, or perhaps I don't know, because some of the shots of Dracula at the beginning, the makeup is just extraordinary. I mean, what were they on? It's just so extreme. And then you see differently filtered, tinted shots where it looks actually rather good. He's still got very prominent lipstick, but maybe you can think he's been drinking blood for centuries. His lips might actually look like that. But the initial shots, you think this makeup, oh dear, what happened there? So there are traces of the problems that they had.
Right. Well, no, like you mentioned the makeup, he almost kind of has a drag queen thing, or it's almost like a kabuki theater. It's very exaggerated in that opening scene. But then by the end of the film, when they're fighting in the temple, it has almost that Mario Bava lighting, right? It's so
It has
exaggerated.
the greens
It
and the
works.
reds, and that reflects very well on the makeup, and he looks very good. I've got a little review here from the time.
Mhm.
You mentioned looking, did you say like a drag queen?
Almost like that, yeah. It's just
Yeah.
very with the red
Well,
lips and the eyebrows and
yeah, in Melody Maker, which is a music paper
yeah.
here, there was a guy called Charles Shaar Murray, who's actually very famous as a rock journalist, but he was reviewing films for them at the time. And this is what he said. Now, bear in mind, I'll give you the little warning. This is a review written in 1974.
Sure.
we have to say that these days.
There you
But
go.
Charles Shaar Murray said, "The Legend of the Seven Gold Vampires is perhaps the worst film I've ever seen. The part of Christopher Lee is played by a gent named John Forbes Robertson, who is not over-endowed with either presence or charisma and looks like an old queen whose makeup has run. The part of Peter Cushing is played rather reluctantly and without much enthusiasm by Peter Cushing. The part of a pair of big tits with a Swedish accent is played by Julie Edge." And he concluded with, "Why do otherwise intelligent people pay money to see this garbage? I don't know. That's why I'm going to see it again next week." Now, Michael Carreras, curiously enough, he virtually had that review framed on his wall. He said, "It's the best review I've read for ages." And of course, Carreras explained the reason it's the best review he'd read for ages is because, he tore it apart, he put his finger on everything that was wrong with it, but then he said, it's great, I'm going to go and see it again next week. So in other words, he was delighted, Michael Carreras was delighted by the fact this was a critic who had taken the film in the spirit in which it was intended. And of course, people who tend to make horror films are constantly being reviewed by people who basically don't like horror films and don't understand them. Whereas here, Charles Sean Murray, who just was spot on, he thought the film was rubbish, but great. And that's the thing that, a lot of critics can't get their head around, that something can be simultaneously rubbish and great. And, Michael Carreras was delighted by that review.
Yes, well, I mean, hey, Big Tits and Peter Cushing, I know they sold me. You don't have to tell me twice. So,
Yes, there you go.
So we've talked a bit about the director Roy Ward Baker, and growing up, I knew that name associated with Hammer films,
Yeah.
Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, Scars of Dracula. But then I was kind of shocked, when I started digging kind of deeper into his filmography. This is the man who made A Night to Remember, which for the longest time was the quintessential film about the sinking of the Titanic. So how do you go from doing this, one of the great British films of all time, to obviously I love these films, but I'm sure in his mind he might thought, okay, maybe I'm slumming it doing these films for Hammer. How do you get to that point?
Well, it's funny, wasn't it? I mean, he's actually got a lot of classic British films to his name in the 50s, Morning Departure, and got his autobiography here. Yes, as you say, A Night to Remember, The One That Got Away, Tiger in the Smoke. He had his moment in Hollywood directing Marilyn Monroe in Don't Bother to Knock.
Yes.
What happened in the early 60s was I think he was a sound engineer or something, because obviously maybe the relevant unions don't have what British Actors Equity has, which is that you cannot have the same name as somebody else. But maybe they don't have that among the technicians unions, because in the early 60s he realised that there was a sound engineer, I think it was a sound engineer, called Roy Baker. No, called Roy Baker, that's it. And he thought, my God, he's got the same name as me. So around about 1962 or 3, Roy Baker changed his name to Roy Ward Baker. And some weird alchemical thing happened at that moment. His career changed course. When he changed his name to Roy Ward Baker, first of all, he went straight into television. He was making things like The Saint, all those great action series of the 60s. So he spent a few years doing television. And then Hammer came along and asked him to rescue a film that they had currently shooting called The Anniversary with Betty Davis. And Betty Davis had fired the director, Alvin Rakoff, and they got Roy Ward Baker in to help out. And then suddenly, having done that, and then a few months later, he does... actually, I think it... no, actually, his first Hammer film, I think, was Quatermass and the Pit. And what a marvellous film that is. Marvellous film, sort of Gothic science fiction. Then he did The Anniversary, and suddenly he was sort of... the go-to guy for Hammer. And then Amicus came along, because Amicus often used to pick on the same personnel that Hammer used, and suddenly he was a director of Gothic horror films. And I think, yes, he was probably as perplexed as you are. He was perplexed at the time, as you are now looking back. It was a strange sort of career swerve. But, after the British horror, kind of classic period had faded away, he still had more television in him. And I think he'd done 3 films already with Peter Cushing when making this, The Legend of the Silver and Golden Vampires. And, 10 years later, they get together again to make a Sherlock Holmes film for television called The Masks of Death. So, it was by no means the end of his career, but it certainly was a big change in his career. And I think it was... Who knows? It was something to do with changing his name. Perhaps, people, film executives have very short memories. Perhaps if suddenly you're no longer called Roy Baker, you're now Roy Ward Baker, and people think, who the hell's that? And so they've forgotten who directed A Night to Remember. Yeah. And so now you're making The Vampire Lovers and stuff like that.
Exactly.
He was an absolute professional. But of course, he was professional in a specific idiom, which was the English-speaking cinematic world. And going to Hong Kong was a huge shock, and he was not very happy at all in the course of making the film. But never mind.
One thing I've kind of observed in the last few years, I've started kind of breaching out into more like international cinema. I grew up, of course, with the Hammer films. You have the American Westerns. And then, I start watching more of these Hong Kong martial arts films, the Japanese samurai films, the Italian sword and sandal gladiator films. And it's interesting when you look at what we would now probably consider like exploitation, kind of the lower budget entertainment films that each of these countries would put out. The United Kingdom, Italy, Hong Kong, Japan. I mean, these are all fundamentally the same story, right? It all goes back to the roots of humanity. At the end of the day, these are all morality plays. They're about good versus evil. You have the lone stranger riding into town to save the day, to help the villagers fight back against the corrupt system, but they're all kind of filtered. They're all fundamentally the same story, but they're filtered through whatever that country's cultural heritage is, right? You
Yes.
know, the Hong Kong films are based very much in Chinese mythology, history, uh, of course, the Italian sword and sandal films, the history of ancient Rome, the glory of ancient Rome, and even the Hammer horror films. These are based in the tradition of the English Gothic literature, which at the end of the day, it's all about good versus evil, about the one man fighting to defend what's his honor against the evil and corruption of society. So it's all kind of fascinating that these became the fodder for what we consider the American Western, the horror film, and the action film. And in a movie
Yeah.
like Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, this is an opportunity for many of these cultural ideas to overlap into one film.
Well, as you say, there are only so many stories.
Hmm.
And so, a quest narrative, which this one specifically, I suppose,
Yeah.
is there's a kind of universality to that because, as you say, all cultures have them,
Hmm.
and also the other facets of the story, the subplots and what have you. Again, they're things that have a universal application. So, my initial reaction all those years ago, kung fu and gothic horror, what?
Yeah.
But in fact, they mesh rather well because, these fundamental stories that people feel compelled to tell again and again, they're like folk myths in a way, aren't they? But they're
Yeah.
formed into narratives. But they do have a universal application because they're the same all
Hmm.
around the globe, essentially. And, in its sort of maybe inadvertent way, that's what the Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires tapped into.
Hmm.
And I can see why, fans of martial arts films like this film a lot, and I can see why fans of the classic British Gothic horrors also like this film a lot, because it's actually a very clever fusion of them.
Kind of doing my research into Hammer films and looking into the history, you see all this amazing. I don't know if you want to call it conceptual artwork, but these were posters made to pitch these films to distributors to make money,
Yeah,
so they can, I guess,
yeah, yeah,
pre-sell the package before the movie is made.
yeah.
And around this time, I've seen images of there's Peter Cushing starring in Kali, the Devil Bride of Dracula, or sort of variations of that, where I imagine you're taking the same premise, you're taking the Gothic horror of Van Helsing, and he's fighting the vampires of another culture, in this case, India.
Yeah.
So I mean, after the experience of working with the Shaw brothers, were there plans to go to India and collaborate with the Bollywood studio, or what were the initial ideas for a follow-up?
Well, actually, the plans for the Indian subject predated The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires.
Oh, wow.
Tony Hines, who was one of the big creative forces at Hammer, either just before he retired or just after he retired, and he'd had experience in India during the war, so he knew the culture very well, and he
Hmm.
wrote. I'm not sure, I can't remember what the original title of it was in 1970, but it's a script that went through all sorts of permutations. And you're right, around about the time of this film, it had become Kali, Devil Bride of Dracula, and Tom Chantrell painted a very striking pre-production poster for it. Later on, it became The Unquenchable Thirst of Dracula, because in
Yes.
the wake of this one, it was hoped, I think the original idea behind it was because Warner Brothers had rupees that were frozen in India. So the
Hmm.
only way they could unfreeze these rupees was to spend them in India, i.e.,
Hmm.
make a film in India. For one reason or another, none of these plans actually panned out. But in the wake of this film, which transferred the idea to Hong Kong, in the wake of this film, they did have hopes that they could do that Indian subject again, or rather, they could finally get round to it. And it eventually became called The Unquenchable Thirst of Dracula. Curiously enough, at a big film festival we have here called Mayhem, about 8 years ago, I think, I actually narrated a reading of that script, that Tony Hines script, The Unquenchable Thirst of Dracula. It's a very interesting script. And subsequently, inspired by this reading at the film festival, the BBC Radio thought, aha. And so they took that script and they put it on the radio. So, and I'm sure if you hunt around, you might somehow or other be able to find that recording actually of the Unquenchable. If you want to know what it's like, you can listen to that recording. It's a very interesting script actually, The Unquenchable Thirst of Dracula. It gives Dracula quite a bit more to do than he has in Seven Golden Vampires. But yes, that after this film, Hammer's time was not quite, but very nearly up. So that Indian Dracula subject was one of many titles in the mid-70s that never got made. They wanted to make a film based on the comic book Vampirella. They wanted to make a film about the Loch Ness Monster, which would have involved getting together with Toho in Japan, which I suppose is a similar-ish idea to getting together with the Shaw Brothers in Hong Kong. There were all sorts of wonderful ideas they had, which never came to fruition. But the whole British film industry was going down the chute, so the fact that Hammer did as well is not entirely surprising. It's traditional to think that Hammer were out of touch and out of step, but and of course after The Exorcist, that is indeed how they appeared. The way The Exorcist killed the taste for Gothic horror was literally like turning off a tap, because Hammer had been very fecund, if you like. They'd had all sorts of new. In the 70s, they made some very interesting films. They were trying to think of new spins on their old formulae, and very often they worked. They may not have been huge hits, but they were making some interesting films. But after this film, which again was a very interesting idea to ring the changes on their old formulae, maybe those the changes that they rang weren't quite radical enough. And once The Exorcist came out, they did actually make a very good fist of making a very nasty film about devil worship, To the Devil a Daughter. Now that's a very interesting and powerful film, but it was too little, too late, really, if you like. So the sort of critical commonplace that Hammer were old-fashioned and out of step, I'm not sure it's quite true. They made a huge effort not to be so, and some of the results are very, very interesting. But I think one of Hammer's producers said, there was a time and then there wasn't a time. And of course, this applies artistically, this applies across the board, doesn't it? There's a time for something and then that time has gone. And that's what happened to Hammer in the 70s. Having said that, Hammer have produced some very interesting things in the 21st century, having been revived. So, never say die, as it were.
And like you said, this film ends up becoming hugely influential with the rise of the Blade franchise, Underworld, Van Helsing, even the Stephen Sommers Mummy trilogy owes a debt to this, combining action and horror, period horror.
I've seen people say that it influenced, I don't know, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, or Big Trouble in Little China, to go further back into the 80s. Yeah, I mean, it's influenced the whole intersection between action cinema and vampire and Gothic cinema, if you like, was really an entirely new thing. Actually, Hammer, a couple of years before this, had made a film called Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter. Actually, they both came out in 1974, and that does something similar. That is the sort of first attempt at mixing swordplay and vampirism, for instance. That has a go, but they really went for it with The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, and it did actually create, it wasn't immediately apparent by any means, but when everything came out in the wash, looking back 20 years later or so, you think, good Lord, that film that people maybe laughed at back in 1974, but that film created a subgenre. So, yeah, who would have thought it?
One we still enjoy to this day. If you're in the audience, I hope you enjoyed the film as much as we did. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.